Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be discussing project management. My name is Patrick Allen, and I'm the Program Manager for Kent State's Center for Corporate and Professional Development's Public Open Enrollment Programs. Our center specializes in providing employee development for partnering organizations in Northeast Ohio and around the country. We offer training as public open enrollment programs delivered in Independence and also on-site customized programs delivered at your location. I am joined today by Kent State Facilitator Bob Jewell. I will be serving as your host, and Bob will be our presenter for today. Bob has nearly 30 years of hands-on experience managing projects. His project consulting experience varies from those such as the fabrication of the world's largest hydroelectric turbines, development of an open heart surgery program, startup of a new aircraft engine repair facility, and the development and implementation of new manufacturing processes. Bob's ability to manage projects and to teach others how to manage projects has earned the trust of clients such as Toyota, General Electric, Federal Express, Sherwin-Williams, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and over 55 other organizations. Bob has partnered with Kent State for over 15 years. He is the lead facilitator in our certificate in project management, which includes essential skills for managing projects, advanced skills for managing projects, and project leadership. Bob is also part of the Certificate of Supervision team, in which he facilitates the Making Great Decisions program. Everyone in attendance today has been muted to avoid background noise from any of the over 200 registered participants. We do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the hour. You can submit your questions in writing using the control panel on the right side of your screen. I will present your questions to the presenter as the time permits throughout the hour. There is also a handout available to you that summarizes today's presentation. It is located under the Handouts tab on the control panel. We encourage you to download it and take notes during today's presentation. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording after we conclude our time together. We are going to begin today's webinar by asking you a question, the question of you, the participants. And that question is, how critical are projects to the success of your organization? I will give you about 30 seconds to submit your questions, and I will present the results to the audience. So there we see the results of the poll, and now I will turn the presentation over to our presenter, Bob Jewell.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning. I've chosen for today just some of the highlights out of our two-day project management program, the things that tend to grab the most attention from people when we do the class. So I thought we'd start out by defining what a project is. Believe it or not, there's confusion on that every now and then. A concept that I present in the class called the key elements of the project hierarchy, and that will tie in with a number of other things we do today. I'm going to walk you through very quickly the four-phase process for managing projects, which generally covers about 90–95% of the projects most people do. And then I decided to add to today how to create a work breakdown structure, which is one of the tools in project management that people in the class find to be very, very helpful. A number of people have commented that after they've taken the class, this is one of the things they go back and immediately use in their organization. So let's start out by just kind of taking a look at what today's workplace looks like. If that circle there would represent all the work that we do in organizations, we really can start to split that circle into project work and operational day-to-day work, and we all have built up a toolbox for doing our operational day-to-day work. Difficulty is when we move over and start to do projects, those tools tend to be inadequate, and we need to kind of add another toolbox. And in the classroom, at least over 2 days, we're going to put a lot of tools in that toolbox. Obviously, the work breakdown structure that we're going to talk today about is one of those. So with that started, let's define what a project is. Most of the definitions I use in the class come from the Project Management Institute. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with that group, but it's an international group headquartered here in the United States that is kind of a governing body for the most part of project management. So for the most part, that's where my definitions come from. And we always want people to know that when they take the class, that's kind of the basis of where the material is coming from, is from the Project Management Institute. So PMI defines a project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product or service. The key word in that definition is the word temporary. Projects are temporary. That means they have starts and finishes, which is one of those things that really separates projects from our day-to-day work. Most of our day-to-day operational work tends to just be ongoing things that we do, but projects tend to have a start, tend to have a finish, and tend to be unique. The project hierarchy is one of the concepts that I developed for the class, just to give people kind of a 40,000-foot view of the 3 key pieces of information that we need to know if we're going to effectively manage a project. The first one is why. Why are we doing this project? What's the goal? What are the objectives of the project? Some people may call that what's the business need, or the goal, or possibly the vision. But I think if we're getting ready to commit valuable company resources to a project, it would be a pretty good idea to get clear on why we're doing it. The hierarchy then follows that after we know the why, we need to find out what the what is. What deliverables do we need to actually create to achieve that goal and meet those objectives? And those deliverables are always accompanied with requirements. That's where we have to sit down and talk to the customer that we're doing the project for, because obviously the customer is the one who receives those deliverables. The requirements must be mutually agreed upon, and that may be a result of some negotiation with the customer. Actually, when 1 and 2 are on this document and this hierarchy are finished, we actually create what's called a project charter so that those are documented, agreed to, and signed off, which is a big benefit in creating buy-in with the various stakeholders that are involved in the project. The third element of the hierarchy is the how, or the activities or work that we actually need to do to create the deliverables. And this is absolutely a critical part of project management. After we understand the goal, objectives, the deliverables, requirements, we've got that signed off, everybody's agreed that we're pointed in this direction, or a term that I like to use in the class is that we're all on the same page as to why we're doing the project and what has to get created. Then we move down to identify the actual work that needs to get done in the project. Ironically, in our day-to-day work, our operational work, we tend to jump right into activities, not worried so much about the why or the what. But in project management, it's important that we start up at the why, move to the what, and then move to the how. The fact that this is a hierarchy indicates that if we don't get clear on number 1, we're not going to be able to get clear on number 2. And if we don't get clear on number 2, we're not going to get clear on number 3. The ramifications of not getting clear on the activities is significant, because if we're going to build a good schedule for the project, we're going to build an accurate budget for the project, and we're going to be able to accurately assign resources to the project, it's very important that we know what the activities are that we have to do. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with one of the big problems in project management is people refer to as scope creep. That scope creep could actually occur at the goal level, where we thought we were clear on why we're doing the project, but all of a sudden the why starts to change. Well, obviously, according to this hierarchy, if the why changes, the what's impacted and the how's impacted. Or we could have scope creep at the deliverable level or at the requirement level around an already agreed upon deliverable. But again, if we get creep there, it's going to have an impact on the activities. And believe it or not, we can get scope creep down at the activity level. People just start throwing in additional activities to the project that really don't have anything to do with creating the deliverables that we agreed to or achieving the goal that we agreed to on what we call the project charter. So in the 2-day class, participants will actually get a chance to create a project charter for a project that we do in the classroom and understand what the key elements of a project charter are. But at a 40,000 foot level, it's really the why and the what. And of course, we'll actually start to address who's going to be on the project team and who's managing the project at that point. I get asked a lot in the class that when you look at this hierarchy, what's really, is there one particular element there that's key? And in my opinion, it's the deliverables, for the simple reason that that's what the customer is going to get. And if they don't get the deliverables that meet their requirements, they're not going to be happy. The activities are really more important to the project team. Again, if you're going to build an accurate budget, assign people, build an accurate, reliable schedule, we've got to get a really good clear on the activities. And in my experience out in projects as a consultant, this is an area that I find lacks a lot. So let me walk you first through the basic 4-phase process for how to manage a project. And then I'm going to come back and put some emphasis on the work breakdown structure, which is a tool that's used to help us get clarity of those activities. So the 4-phase process for managing a project is initiation phase. And here's all the things that we talk about in the class that go on in initiation. Remember, we mentioned earlier that a project is a temporary endeavor. So the kickoff meeting is really important because we need a clear start to the project. And that start is the kickoff meeting. At the kickoff meeting, we're going to work to identify the goal and objectives, 2 things you just saw on the project hierarchy, work on deliverables, put our team together, clarify requirements, again, additional items that you saw on the previous slide with the hierarchy. Issues always come up at the beginning of the project, so we're going to start and maintain an issues log so that we can record those and have people follow up on them. And then, of course, we have to start interacting with stakeholders and identifying who the key stakeholders are in the project. Obviously, people like customer, possibly vendors, clearly the members of our project team, our project manager, whoever may be sponsoring the project at an executive level. So those are the things we do in initiation phase. The key tool that's being used there is the project charter. When that charter gets approved, we move over into planning. Notice right at the beginning of planning, we're on that 3rd element of the hierarchy, getting clear on the activities that we need to do to create the things that we just agreed to during the initiation phase. And really our work in planning after that is to just start adding detail to the activities. So for instance, we'll start to put them in sequence. We'll talk about that this morning. We start to assign the resources that we need to get them. And of course, this is where we realize we don't have enough resources to do all the projects that we have assigned to us. We start to put a cost on those activities, help us develop a budget. We assign durations, which will obviously help us build the schedule. We'll also do some risk analysis, what could get in the way of producing the deliverables that we just agreed to. Obviously, our budget and schedule gets built. Once our schedule's built, we can calculate what's called the critical path of the project. We also need to deal with change management, have a process in place so that if people want to creep our scope, there's a formal way to request that and go through approvals. And then the last element in planning is put a communication plan together. Who are all the people that we need to talk to and talk with during the project? At that point, we put a project plan together and get the project plan signed off, just like we did the project charter during the initiation phase. After planning, we move into executing and controlling the project. So now we're actually out doing the project. And you'll notice here that we're really just tracking things. We're tracking cost against a budget that we put together in planning. We're tracking a schedule based on a schedule and the use of the critical path, tracking quality all the way back to the requirements and the deliverables that we agreed to in the initiation phase. We're monitoring risk. Of course, it's not possible that we can identify all risk. There's always some unknown risk that may occur. Change control, because people want to make changes to the project. So we're using our change control process that we put together in planning. And then just issuing status reports, which is really a form of communication to let people know how the project's coming, what the status is, are we on schedule, off schedule, on budget, off budget. The person that controls the end of the execution control phase is a customer. They're not going to tell us the project's over until they've received deliverables that meet the requirements that were agreed upon all the way back on the project charter done during the initiation phase. A lot of people would like to think that the project's over at this point. We've delivered everything to the customer, we're done, but you'll notice there's one more phase, and it's a really important one. It's called closing. Some companies refer to it as closeout. Toyota actually refers to it as the reflection phase of the project. I've heard some people call it the postmortem, but I'm not sure that is a good term for the closing phase of the project. So in closing, all we're going to do is look back, wrap up, do some interviews with key stakeholders, collect actuals. How did we do on schedule? How did we do on cost? We're going to assess those actuals and provide some commentary. There's always lots of lessons to learn when a project's finished up. We actually have a closeout meeting. So you notice that we defined a project as a temporary endeavor. Well, temporary would infer there's a clear start and a clear finish. Well, the clear start was the kickoff meeting, and the clear finish is the closeout meeting. And obviously what we're going to do at closeout meetings is identify ways we can improve a future project. Take what we've learned from this project, apply it, so it's a continuous improvement, almost a loop that will take us back to the next project that we initiate and say, what have we learned based on the project that we just finished up? In the two-day class, we literally walk through all four of these phases. Day one, in the afternoon, we're in the initiation phase. We spend most of the day until around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the second day in planning, because as you can see from the slide, planning has the most things going on. If you refer to the Project Management Body of Knowledge book that's put out by the Project Management Institute, PMI, that I mentioned earlier, in that book, there's approximately 49 processes that they identify associated with project management, and about approximately 23 of those occurred during planning, so close to 50% of the processes associated with project management occurred during planning. So in the two-day class, I put a lot of emphasis on planning because evidence is if we put a good plan together, generally things go well when we execute and control the project. And of course, we have change control and risk monitoring going on in that phase to make sure that things that we didn't anticipate happen, we have a way to deal with that. What I wanted to spend the rest of our time on is I want to focus in on just one thing off this picture, and that's the third element of the hierarchy, which is the project activities. There's different types of activities in a project, so we define what those are. But an activity is a distinct scheduled portion of work performed during the course of a project to create a deliverable and, of course, create that deliverable to the agreed upon requirements. Since activities cost time and money, we've got to be in great control of these during a project, because if we're not, we can run into schedule issues and budget issues very quickly. Work breakdown structure is the project tool that's used with the project team to document what the activities of the project are. The definition from the latest 6th edition of the PMI, Project Management Body of Knowledge, is what PMBOK stands for. It's a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. The term scope of work can actually be replaced by activities or task, if you like that word better. So it'd be the hierarchical decomposition of the total activities to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. And actually, if you put the word activities in there instead of scope of work, you'll see that this definition fits the hierarchy that I walked through earlier. It's the activities we do to create the deliverables to achieve the objectives of the project. The key is to get your team in the room when you develop this document, because the team members are subject matter experts, hopefully, around the deliverables and should have a pretty good idea of the type of activities that are necessary to create the deliverables. So the work breakdown structure starts with the project name. We fill in the deliverables, which were already agreed upon with their associated requirements, already agreed upon in the initiation phase and documented and signed off on the project charter. So that what you see on the screen right now has already been created. What we're going to do next is, with team members assigned to each one of those deliverables, any vendors that are going to be associated with the project in the room, any other subject matter experts that we may need in the room, we're simply going to brainstorm the activities that are necessary to create each of the deliverables. And in the classroom, and actually in real life on projects, we do that with Post-it notes. And we actually do it with different colored Post-it notes so that each of the deliverables can be distinguished. A question that comes up a lot in the class is, how detailed should we get with these activities? And the answer I usually give in the classroom is as detailed as necessary. But if you've never done the project before, it's not going to be easy to create a detailed list of all the activities. In fact, it frequently happens if it's a brand new project, we may be missing some of the activities. We just don't know what we don't know. I've seen work breakdown structures on real projects that exceed 1,800 activities that have been identified. Typically, that would be a multi-phased project with obviously a lot of deliverables involved. It's also important to note at this point that it's not necessary that these activities be in sequence. They just need to be under the representative deliverable.
Hey, excuse me, Bob. We did have a question come in. She said, you mentioned the project team. How do we know who should be on the project team?
Great question. We get that asked in class a lot. The project team should be made up of the people that own a deliverable. I really don't need anybody else on my project team except for the people that own a deliverable. They own a deliverable for maybe a couple reasons. One, we hope, is that they're a subject matter expert around that deliverable. They have experience with that deliverable. Sometimes you just get assigned deliverable even when you're not a subject matter expert. And I joke in the class, you don't want to miss a meeting in which people are being assigned to deliverables, because that's almost a certainty that you'll get assigned to a deliverable if you miss that meeting. But generally, it's a subject matter expert. Every now and then, you may be on a project team or a project where you actually own all the deliverables in that project. My first, obviously, hope would be that you're a subject matter expert on that deliverable. And that means your team's going to be pretty small and your meetings will be short. And because, as often happens, the project manager may be the person that actually owns the 1 or 2 or 3 deliverables that are associated with the project. So you may not even necessarily, Patrick, have a team together for that project, obviously. But generally, the answer to that question would be, my team should be made up of the people that own a deliverable. A question that comes up quite often in class is, what if a deliverable is going to be subcontracted out to a vendor? My recommendation is that the vendor be a member of the project team, because most likely that deliverable is going to have to interface with other deliverables in the project, so they really can't be put in a vacuum and held out from what's going on with the rest of the project. It's very typical these days that 1 or 2 deliverables in a project may be completely subcontracted out to a vendor to handle. So we get the team in the room, we get any other resources that we think may need to be in the room to help us identify the activities, and then we just work with each deliverable. And actually in the classroom with the project example that we use, the teams actually get to do this. And this happens to be, as I mentioned earlier, one of the tools that many people, after they've taken the class, go back and immediately use with their project teams, because they realize they've not sat down and really developed a good list of the activities. And I want to go back and emphasize that if you don't have a good list of activities, the budget's going to be impacted, the schedule's going to be impacted, and your need to understand human resources that are necessary to get the project done are going to be impacted. And those are 3 significant things that are impacted by not having a good idea of what activities are actually necessary in the project. A lot of people, PMI included, calls this document the scope document. You're looking at basically all the work that needs to get done on the project. That work is lined up under its appropriate deliverable. I remember working with a project team on a real project years ago, and when the work breakdown structure was done, and we spent 2 days creating it, after those 2 days, I asked the project team how comfortable they felt with the completeness of this document based on the work that we'd done. And we actually, by the way, had gone off site for those 2 days so that we could really concentrate on this document. And the team felt pretty comfortable that they had about 90–95% of the activities identified for that project. About a year and a half later, when we looked back on that project, the reality was that the work breakdown structure we created was about 45%. And it wasn't because the team just didn't know what they didn't know. It was a kind of a first of a time time project for them, first of a kind project for them. And obviously some changes were made when that project was underway that brought additional activities in. But if you just look back at the activities we actually did when the project was over, which is something that you would do at project closing, the actual initial work breakdown structure we created had been about 40-45% accurate. The reason I mention that is because I've heard some people say, well, if you really don't know how accurate this document is, why would you create it? But again, if you're going to put any type of a budget together or schedule together, you've got to have this document. You've got to know what the activities are. And this is it's an energizing document. Teams like to do it. The Post-it notes, if you go to YouTube and search how to create a work breakdown structure, almost every video you're going to find on YouTube is going to show people standing in a room in front of a whiteboard or a flip chart using Post-it notes. I will also let you in on a secret. I'm asked often in the class, of all the tools that they learn over the 2 days, is there one that I think is really important? I, without hesitation, would tell you the work breakdown structure is the most important tool in project management. And that sounds funny after we spent a whole morning on the first day, or a whole afternoon, on the first day, talking about how to put a project charter. But remember, the project charter captures the first two elements of the hierarchy: the goal and the deliverables and the requirements. And obviously, if that document's not good, it's going to affect our ability to understand activities and put a good work breakdown structure together. So yeah, absolutely, the charter is an important document. But here's why it's important. Because if it's not good, it affects our ability to get clarity of the activities. Our work breakdown structure essentially is only going to be as good as how definitive and how well put together our project charter is. So absolutely, the charter is an important document. But it's important because the document that comes in that third element of the hierarchy, the work breakdown structure, is a very important document and only really can be as good as how good item 1 and item 2 are on the project hierarchy. So very energizing, good team building, chance for the team to get together, rotate around, look at the different activities that people have come up with, take a break, maybe work on some other stuff for 3 or 4 hours and then come back and look at the activities on the work breakdown structure again. Obviously, a document that may take 1 or 2 days to develop based on the experience of the team, and again, may need vendors or outside people involved in the room to accurately identify the activities. So what do we do once we've identified all these activities and lined them up under the appropriate deliverable? Well, when we look across the board at all these activities, they can actually be classified in 3 different ways. Some of those activities won't be able to begin until another predecessor activity is complete. So some of them are logically dependent on each other. So we call these dependent activities. Some of the activities on the work breakdown structure may be able to be performed during the same time frame as another activity. The common term for that would be parallel or independent. And then some of those activities that are on the work breakdown structure we're going to discover must start and finish on time in order for the project to stay on schedule. And it's interesting when I put this slide up in the classroom, if people know what we call those activities. Of course, the formal term is that's a critical path activity, is an activity that must start and finish on time in order for the project to stay on schedule. But I remember putting this slide up during a class a few years ago, and when we got to the third element, and I asked the class, does anybody know what we call an activity that must start and finish on time in order for the project to stay on schedule? One person in the back room said, yes, that's called a doomed activity. I appreciate the humor in that, because obviously you probably don't want to be assigned to an activity that must start and finish, but this is obviously our critical path activities.
Excuse me again, Bob. Speaking of projects that are doomed to fail, we did have a question just come in that says, what do you do when you know the project is off time, off budget, or doomed to fail?
Well, sometimes you just have to pray your way through a project. But there are tools available in project management. If we put a good schedule together, we should be able to go back and evaluate that schedule and find out where we've had a problem. Many times that incident occurs because of scope creep, that we're not doing a very good job of controlling through our change control process. And people are walking in your room and saying things like, hey, while you're at it, or hey, wouldn't this look good too? Or hey, I was thinking last night. And the next thing you know, your project's expanded 2-fold or 3-fold. I think the other part of that question was with budget as well. Same thing. have your change control address people making changes to budgets. Budgets should obviously be approved by, or change control should be approved by project managers. Maybe even senior executives have to get involved in some of those change control. Was there another part of that question, Patrick, that I missed?
No, it was time, budget, and when you just know the project's doomed to fail.
Well, I certainly in my work career have been assigned projects that at some point was clear weren't going to be successful. What I've done is generally document that, make sure I sit down with the project sponsor, explain why I'm feeling that way. Obviously, since very valuable company resources are committed to projects, people, and obviously money, you can make recommendations to terminate a project. You may be turned down with that recommendation, but obviously I think it's part of the responsibility of the project manager, obviously a difficult conversation at times, to sit down and just say, hey, there's reasons why this project's not going to go well, and we either need to address them or maybe put this project on the back burner, or in my case, I recommended that we terminate the project. The issue in that particular project was we came in just not knowing a lot of things, and as the project went forward, we were learning things that were really significantly changing the goal of the project. So yeah, that's a problem, and sometimes in a pure career path, you got to stick it out and try to make a doomed project look as pretty as it can. But I also think the project manager has an obligation to speak up with the project sponsor and bring that information to the table, and let the sponsor make the decision how to go forward on a project that's not, for the sake of a better word, smelling very good. If we can also address that question by going back to a project charter. In the class, I often refer to the project charter as kind of a sniff test. Do we have a good project here? And if it's not smelling good when we put a charter together, all kinds of red flags should go up at that point. And obviously, hopefully the sponsors involved, the senior executives involved at that point, and we can point out things like, hey, we can't get really clear on the deliverables, or we're clear on the deliverables, but the customer can't really get clear on what the requirements are. And obviously, since the deliverables and requirements represent the finish line of the project's not going to be over until the customer accepts those. Obviously, if we're struggling getting our arms around them or getting clarity on them, that should be a huge red flag that this project's in trouble right now. So many companies actually use the project charter as kind of, do we have a good project here? And if we can't pass the criteria that's necessary to put a good project charter together, we should walk away from this project until such time that we can. Obviously, sadly, some companies, even though they don't put a good charter together, still force feed a project into the funnel. And I can almost guarantee that if you can't put a good charter together, the project's going to be doomed. So hopefully we can put some barriers up front, or some checks and balances up front, the project charter being an excellent checks and balances. Do we have a good project? It's a great question. After we get all these activities identified, and obviously because some of them will be dependent and some of them will be parallel, the next step is to build the project schedule. Now, obviously, if we put cost on all those activities that are in the work breakdown structure, that's how we build a budget. We assign somebody to get all those activities done. And we joke in class a lot that, you think you have friends until it gets to the point where you have to start assigning people to get activities, and then nobody returns your phone calls or your emails or makes eye contact with you, because simple eye contact sometimes can get your name assigned to an activity. But obviously, all those activities on the work breakdown structure, a resource has to be assigned. And some of them may go to a vendor, but internally, and that's often when we realize we have a doomed project, Patrick, as the person has, because we simply don't have the resources to get all the work done. And as Dilbert did in one of his cartoons, he throws his hands up over his head and just says, well, I guess I'll be the one assigned to all the activities. So what you can see here is the different color Post-it notes representing the different deliverables. In this case, there are 4 deliverables represented in this picture. Now we have to not only sequence those activities within the deliverable, which would be the black arrows, by the way, on this picture, but we have to ultimately decide where their interdependencies exist with other activities in the project to build our overall schedule. The orange dots in this case are representing where that activity connects to activities associated with different deliverables. So for instance, on the gray dot, or the gray Post-it note, I'm sorry, you'll see it has two orange dots. Why? Because that activity is dependent on a yellow activity, and I think that's kind of like an orange or a salmon color, I guess. So that's why those two orange dots are on there. And we put those orange dots actually on the Post-it note in the classroom so that we know where to connect arrows to activities associated with other deliverables. If you look at the two blue Post-it notes, you'll notice that there's an orange dot on the first one because it has a connection to a yellow activity, obviously an activity from another deliverable. A black arrow indicating that the second activity can't start until the first activity does, and then the orange dot on the second activity indicates the connection down to the gray activity, again, an activity from another deliverable. This picture that you're looking at actually in project management is called a network diagram, or some people refer to it as an activity network diagram. And it's an easy document to create once you have all the Post-it notes, once you have the work breakdown structure done. So in the classroom, we start building this at the deliverable level by the project team member who's responsible for that deliverable. And then using the orange dots, we eventually combined all those small deliverable network diagrams or activity network diagrams together to ultimately create the project schedule. Now, obviously, at this point, when we combine all these together, we'll have somebody assigned to each activity, we'll have a duration put on each one of those activities, and we obviously would already have a cost assigned to those activities. The cost information would have been pulled out to put on a project budget, so obviously the budget, a separate tool from the project schedule. I want to use a few minutes to just really emphasize that one of the things in the two-day essentials class that I put a tremendous amount of emphasis on is building what I call a realistic project schedule. As a consultant out in the field, this is one of the biggest problems I see in the field is unrealistic project schedules, or as I'm sure all of you that are listening know, unrealistic due dates that are placed on projects. One of the things that I put an emphasis on in the class is that when we build a schedule, we're going to build it from left to right. We're not going to build it backward from a due date that's been imposed on a project that may not even be a reasonable due date in light of all the work that we have to do. We're going to build the schedule from left to right based on when we can legitimately start the project and build it in the direction and just see where it ends. It may be that the project schedule ends before the due date that's been imposed on the project, but as I'm sure most of you that are listening and starting to laugh at this point may realize that when we build that schedule left to right, that the finish date goes beyond the date that somebody would like to have the project done. But I don't fear that, because in the class they're going to learn techniques to compress a schedule, or how to get that schedule back to possibility of a date that may not be realistic. Now, of course, the reality of this may be we can't compress the schedule enough, and we've got to address the reality that that unrealistic due date is unrealistic. And that's another discussion we have with project sponsor. And going back to the previous question about what causes projects to be doomed, I would say, based on my own experience, that the number one thing that dooms projects are unrealistic finish dates that are imposed on the project before we even know the amount of work that needs to get done to get the project done. And obviously, the work breakdown structure is going to give us a picture of that work, and as we lay it out in sequence, logical sequence, dependent activities, parallel activities on the schedule, from left to right is generally when we start to realize we need more time for this project than people have actually given us. So we discussed that in some detail in the classroom. We talked about many techniques that are out there in order to compress schedules and see if we can get back to that, what I call unrealistic finish date, or have to deal with the reality that it's going to take more time to get this project done. Of course, another option would be go back to the beginning and maybe redefine the project, remove some of the deliverables, cut back on some of the requirements as a way to compress the project. And then, of course, I joke in class, there's always weekends and overtime, which are sadly often used to pick up the additional time that we need to get an unrealistic schedule back to the proposed due date. A big discussion in class, a good discussion, because I know almost everybody that comes to the class deals with this issue. When I talk about building schedules left to right, many people shake their heads. That's not how we build schedules at our company. We go to the proposed finish date and we build the schedule backward. Well, of course, what you find there is you should have started the project 3 months ago, and generally nobody comes in with time machines, so that's not practical, so we end up force-fitting the project between the date that we can start it and an unrealistic finish date, which is, in my opinion, or quite frankly, a really lousy way to build a project schedule. We also explain what critical path is and how to calculate it in the classroom. We can't do it on this picture because obviously we need durations on these activities to determine where the critical path is, but we talk about that in some detail. Interesting question that I get a lot in the class, since we're using Post-it notes, is to remind people that I actually use Post-it notes on real projects. This isn't just a technique that we're using in the classroom. You've seen us use Post-it notes to create the work breakdown structure. You've seen us use Post-it notes here to arrange the activities. So I thought I'd show you a picture from an actual project that I was involved in a few years ago. We're building, this has happened to be a phase 1 of that project, or what this company called the pre-inspection phase. And obviously you can see all the Post-it notes laid out with arrows, and if you look really closely at some of the lighter color Post-it notes, you can see the orange dots that exist on them. So the point I want to make here is this just isn't a technique that we're using in the classroom. This is a technique that people that attend the class can actually go back and use. Now, this also doesn't mean I'm not against, or I'm against project management software. Obviously, project management software is a great tool. And this diagram or document or activity network diagram that you see here in this picture, absolutely, I could go home and type all those into Microsoft Project or some other project software tool and let that document spit it out. But not everybody has software. And the project may be not long enough or big enough in its scope to justify making the kind of investment in software and training. So I obviously want to show people that you can do this with Post-it notes. Typically what I do in the projects that I consult with is we would lay this document out with Post-it notes when we're comfortable that we have all the sequences correct. Then we'll take that and go into project software. So in the afternoon of day 2 of the Essentials class, we talk about software. I share a little bit about my experience with the softwares that I found to be helpful. And of course, there's always a lot of dialogue with the folks in the class about software their particular company is using. But I do want to emphasize that project management is a lot more than having project management software. I always tell in the classroom, a few years ago, I walked into a classroom, and at the start of a 2-day class, one of the participants came up to me and said, "I'm really not sure why I'm taking this class. I already have the software." And I kind of smiled and I said, well, I think what you're going to learn over the next 2 days is a lot more things associated with project management than the fact that you've got the software. Obviously, software is a great tool, helps us build budgets, helps us track budgets, helps us build schedules, helps us track schedules, helps us calculate critical paths on a project, helps us deal with decisions that we have to make in real time when a project's underway. But I emphasize in the class, it doesn't make you a project manager. And people that think that if I have the software, I'm a project manager, and the software is going to give me every tool that I need to manage a project, they're going to learn in the class that's not true. I think I've covered all the highlights of that I wanted to cover in the class, so I think we'll leave it up to what kind of questions we might get.
Okay, we did have some questions come in, so I would like to address those. The first question, Bob, is, in your experience, what is the #1 cause of project failure?
Wow. Well, I will share with you this isn't my opinion. Obviously, a lot of organizations study this. A lot depends on the type of project. Software projects, which are not projects I get involved in a whole lot, we tend to find scope creep, people just adding on things beyond what we thought the project would be. Software projects have been studied a lot because obviously a lot of organizations, software and IT is very important these days. Hospitals have spent a lot of time doing this. A group called the Standish organization a few years ago did a big study on reasons for failure. And the #1 reason in at least in software projects was scope creep. I'm not so sure that's not at least a #1 or #2 reasons in projects outside software projects as well. So I'd put scope creep right up there. People just throwing in everything in the kitchen sink into the project after we've got it started. And it's really not starting off with a well-defined, well-bought-in understanding of the clear goal of the project and the clear deliverables that have to get created to achieve that. And right behind that, I would add, from my own experience, and I think this is backed up by some of the research, is unrealistic due dates that are placed on projects. I remember a few years ago working with a corporation that told me they had to have a project done by the end of the third quarter. They weren't getting budgeting for the project in the fourth quarter. And I remember turning to the chief financial officer of that company and saying, what if we find out all the work involved to get this project done can't be done by the end of the third quarter? And he says, well, I think that's why we're using project management. Well, ironically, we discovered that when we laid out the project, for the schedule for that project, the work took us all the way into February the following year. And I remember laying that out in front of him, and he's saying that's unacceptable. This project has to be done by the end of the third quarter. And my response back was, then we're going to have to decrease the scope of this project, because you won't get what you want done now by the end of the third quarter. And of course, that led to some good discussions. And so scope creep usually is at the top, unrealistic finish dates, lack of clarity. Most projects I get involved in as a consultant, sadly, are already in the execution control phase, and they're in a mess. And I usually will ask for a copy of the project charter, and I usually get a blank stare, indicating nobody sat down at the beginning of the project and really clarified the why are we doing this project, the what. They just kind of jumped into it. It's like not being able to swim and deciding that you're going to jump into the deep end of the swimming pool. Not a good idea. Someone else asked, a great question we get in class a lot is the difference between project management and Lean Six Sigma. Well, having spent a lot of years with Toyota and Toyota organization and done a training in a lot of their facilities around the country, obviously Toyota's a big Lean company. They tie in. Every time you're doing a Lean Six Sigma project, you're actually using project management. Some teams are taught. General Electric, for instance, teaches all their black belts project management as part of their Six Sigma black belt program. The reason General Electric did that is because they recognize that if they only have Six Sigma skills and they don't know how to manage a project, they won't be using their Six Sigma skills to the full benefit. So the two go together in the sense that every time you're doing a Lean Six Sigma project, guess what? It's a project. And using project management skills is a great way. They're often obviously short-term projects that we move through very quickly, but most people that have been around Lean Six Sigma projects already are familiar with the term project charter or charter, because they create a charter for those projects. We then bring in the work breakdown structure tool and some schedule building tools and maybe possibly some budget schedule tools. And you've got a really good blend of project management skills with Lean Six Sigma skills. Great question.
Okay, we're actually getting a lot of questions coming in. So the next one, I am managing more than 10 projects at once. Do you have any recommendations?
Besides that, I'll pray for you. Make sure those projects have really good charters. Make sure you're spending time with your manager on the priority of these projects. I'm guessing from the way the question was asked, you assume that 10 is too many. So I've been in that same situation as an employee in the past, and what's important is communicating with your manager to make sure you understand the priority of those projects so that you're working on the ones that must be finished. It's ironic that generally the priorities can be established, by the way, by the due dates. Obviously, a project that has a due date that's pretty close to where you're looking at the calendar right now would have to be a high priority project.
Okay, next question. When creating the charter, what's something to look back to or reference and keep in mind as we go through the requirements of the project?
By the way, just going to go back to that last question for a minute. We do talk about multiple projects in the advanced project management class. That was a topic that we don't get into in the essentials class because we're really focused there on just how to get through a project. But you can't do a class on project management eventually and not get to it. So it's covered in the advanced class. With regards to the charter and requirements, obviously a great tool would be go back and look at charters from previous projects that were similar. Or if this is with an internal or external customer, previous projects that were done in the past with this external or internal customer to kind of see where there were problems with the requirements or questions that you may had or difficulty you may had getting your arms around those requirements. Obviously, this is something we can talk about at closeout too. If we get done with the project and look back and say, wow, we thought we were clear on the requirements up front, but now that we have that 2020 vision with the project over, go back and look at that. So I'd refer you back to other documents that were used in similar projects or reflections on communications with this particular customer on other projects that you've worked on. But getting clarity around those requirements is absolutely essential, because I think everybody that's probably listening realizes that that's the acceptance criteria of the project. Until the customer agrees that the requirements have been met, customer's not going to agree that the project's over. So it's very, very important that we get clarity of those. If we can't get clarity of those, that could be a good reason to walk away from the project and say, hey, we're having problems getting clarity of the acceptance criteria, i.e. the requirements. Maybe this project, as I said earlier, the sniff test of the charter, maybe this isn't the right time to do this project until we can get clarity. Or the other option would be go into a phase one, kind of for the sake of a better term, an R&D mode, where we can use phase one to work with the customer to get clarity of the requirements. Great question.
Okay, next question. What is the best method to estimate an activity duration?
Horoscope, flip a coin, no. I'm a big believer that the duration estimate needs to come from the person doing the work. And I don't think too many of you will be surprised how many times I look at a schedule, look at a duration estimate that's on an activity, ask the client, could you explain to me where that duration estimate came from? And I learned that it did not come from the person doing the work, or the vendor for that matter, if it's going to be outsourced. So I'm a big fan of going to that resource. Obviously, that resource should know what their availability is on a calendar in light of all the other projects they're doing and the day-to-day work that they need to get done, and then give us an estimate. Now, obviously, some people can way overestimate an activity, and so we'll track that activity when the project's underway, and obviously when that project is finished, we'll know exactly how long that activity took. And a comment that comes up in the class a lot is, well, if they've overestimated it, what makes you think they won't use that overestimate when they do the project? Well, that's why it's important to track the project while it's underway. We talk a little bit about a technique called buffering, where obviously if you're doing an activity for the first time and you've never done it before, you probably will need to buffer it, because most people underestimate how long it takes to do an activity that we've never done before. But obviously, if it's an activity we've done before, we should be able to pull some other people in who have done it and get a feel for how long that activity takes. And the same, by the way, of all that would apply to budgeting as well. Obviously, we have to assign a cost to each activity, and if we've never done the activity before, costing and building a budget around activity can be quite difficult too.
Okay, next question. How detailed do you get with the work breakdown structure? Do you use the 880 rule?
I'm not sure I've ever heard the 880 rule before. I'm familiar with it, but obviously the answer to that question, and I don't mean to be glib with this, is we try to get that work breakdown structure as detailed as we can get it. But with the example that I used earlier, a team once thought that they had it 95% accurate, and we learned afterwards it was not that accurate. And that's not a fault of the team. It's just an issue. They didn't know what they know. They didn't know what they didn't know. So you do the best with your team to create that document as detailed as you can, but I will tell you that there's a lot of times, unless you've done this project over and over again in the past you've done it and got experience with it, you're going to miss things, and that's just the nature of projects, that you'll miss things. But I've never found it a mistake to work to make the work breakdown structure as detailed as possible. That time for that detail is beneficial. It pays off with a better schedule, better budget, and better idea of how many human resources we need for the project.
Okay, I think that's about all the time we have for questions, but I do want to ask one final question of the audience. And that is, have you ever had any formal project management training? Just going to give you a little bit of time to answer this one. And there are the results. It looks like just a little over 50-50, about 58 to 42. So that is all the time that we have for today, and I do want to thank everybody for joining us. If you would like to learn more about today's topic and project management, we encourage you to register for one of the upcoming programs that will be delivered on September 25th and 26th at the Educational Service Center of Northeast Ohio, located in Independence, Ohio. You can see the registration link on your screen, and I do encourage you to register soon, as these programs do routinely fill. We can also tailor any program and develop it on-site for your team. You can join our extensive list of clients and bring Kent State to your organization. You can contact us at 330-672-3416 or email us at yourtrainingpartner@kent.edu. We also encourage you to register for our next webinar, when we will be discussing emotional intelligence and empathy with Kent State facilitator Alberto Arroyo. During this webinar, we will discuss what is empathy and how it can be improved using emotional intelligence. For those attending live, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please complete this survey so that we can be assured that we are bringing you the most usable and relevant content possible. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Kent State Center for Corporate and Professional Development and our facilitator, Bob Jewell, thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day and a great weekend.